The wind came down off the ridgeline like it had a bone to pick. It wasn't the kind that stung your cheeks and passed on. It stayed, swirled, sank its teeth into your joints, and didn't let go. By the time Wyatt Ford realized the sky had turned, he was already too far from town and too stubborn to double back. He'd been through snow before. But this was different. The snow didn't fall. It arrived like a herd of ghosts galloping sideways through the trees. By nightfall, visibility was near zero. His horse shivered beneath him. Even the silence had a weight to it, like the land was holding its breath. He found the cabin more by habit than by sight, an old trapper's post he'd fixed up 2 winters earlier. Logs blackened from past fires, roof sagging just enough to whisper doubt. But it had walls, a stone hearth, and half a cord of wood he'd forgotten he'd stacked behind it. That alone felt like providence. He unsaddled the horse with frozen fingers and pushed into the dark shelter, lighting a fire with his second match. The flicker of flame danced over the corners of the room-bare walls, thick beams, and his own breath curling into the air like worry made visible. Wyatt was no greenhorn. He'd been on trail drives from Texas to Montana, seen lightning split sky and river alike, once even cauterized a bullet wound with a branding iron. But none of that had prepared him for the strange thing happening now. He couldn't think, couldn't focus. His mind, usually sharp as a hawk in spring, felt fogged, like someone had stuffed cotton in between his ears. He sat down, tried to count how many days he had till the herd would be expecting him back. Lost track after 3. Tried to remember the name of the trapper who'd first shown him this place. Gone. Even his hands, usually steady, fumbled the flint when he went to spark kindling again. That's when he knew. It wasn't just the cold on his skin, it had gotten into his mind. He had no liquor, no tobacco. His jerky was stiff as boot leather and didn't taste like much more. But in his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, nestled next to a dry tin of gunpowder, he had something better. A pouch of roasted coffee beans, not ground, not flavored. Just whole, hard beans he'd intended to trade in town. And as he held them over the fire that night, something his grandfather used to say came drifting back like the smoke itself was whispering it. In the snow, it ain't your hands that freeze first. It's your thinking. Heat the beans right, and your mind stays yours. The words landed like a hoof on stone. He stared into the flame, and for the first time since the storm began, Wyatt Ford remembered something worth doing. He wouldn't sleep tonight, not until he figured out how to brew clarity from a handful of beans and a fire barely strong enough to survive the wind. And somewhere outside, the snow piled deeper, but inside, the ember of an idea had begun to glow. Wyatt held the pouch in his palm like it was something sacred. The beans were stiff and oiled from time in the leather bag, rattling like gravel when he shook them. He could still hear the man who'd first handed him that trick, his mother's father, Elias Lorne, half Comanche, half trouble, and all grit. A man who swore by 3 things: a good knife, dry socks, and never boiling your coffee if you wanted to keep your edge. Elias used to roast beans on a flat iron over mesquite coals, not in a pot, not in water. He claimed the scent itself was medicine. Ain't just what you drink, he'd say. It's what it wakes up before you drink. Wyatt hadn't thought of that man in years. But now, trapped in this storm, the memory poured in like steam off a hot cup, the kind of wisdom you don't remember until survival squeezes it out of you. The fire was going now, small but sure. Wyatt cleared a patch of ash and dragged a flat stone closer to the gar. Coals. No pan, no grate, no fancy gear, just instinct and memory. He dropped a handful of beans onto the stone and watched as they danced in the heat. Not too fast, Elias had warned about that. Burn the beans and you burn the mind. The goal was slow warmth, enough to coax the oils out, enough to perfume the air. And that's what happened. After 5 minutes, the cabin changed. The dampness in the logs gave way to something round and familiar. Not food, not comfort. Alertness. Like the cabin itself was shaking off the snow and waking up with him. He rolled the beans gently, using the tip of his knife. They cracked softly, whispering promise. Not the violent pop of boiled grounds, but a dry release of scent and life. He didn't have a grinder. just a rock and the back of his knife. So he crushed them crude, just enough to open their bodies and let the oils breathe. Then came the hard part, the brew. With no percolator, no enamel pot, and no clean tin, Wyatt reached for what he did have, his canteen cup and an old strip of saddle cloth. He lined the cloth inside the cup like a sieve, filled it with the crushed beans, and dripped melted snow through it, slow as prayer. The liquid was more tincture than coffee. Thick, dark, smoky, not pleasant, not smooth. But when he drank it, he felt something shift behind his eyes. The fog lifted. Not all the way, but enough. His thoughts lined up in rows, his heartbeat slowed. He remembered his own name, the year, the trail, the herd waiting down south. Most important, he remembered why he couldn't afford to lose focus. Storms weren't just cold, they were thieves. They stole movement, direction, clarity. But maybe, just maybe, Elias had been right. Maybe the right roast at the right time could keep your mind lit while everything else froze, and Wyatt wasn't about to let his thoughts go dark again. The wind outside didn't scream, it whispered, low and constant, like something that had settled in for the long haul. Inside the cabin, Wyatt sat with his knees drawn close, eyes fixed on the fire. It was stable now, but only barely, the kind of flame that flickered high one minute and sulked the next. He knew better than to trust it. In weather like this, the fire had to be managed, not just lit. It needed coaxing, discipline, like a nervous horse. He reached for the long iron barrel of his Hawken rifle. It was cold from leaning against the log wall. He didn't need it for shooting, not tonight. But he needed its length, its weight. He used it like a poker, easing the wood forward, stirring the embers from below without collapsing the structure. He remembered Elias again, how the old man used to say, "Don't feed a fire like a drunk feeds a horse. Be quiet. Let it breathe." The rifle moved the coals with precision. Wyatt didn't jab, he guided. The goal wasn't just heat anymore. It was balance. A fire that burned too hot would scorch the coffee and drain his strength. Too weak, and the beans wouldn't steep right. And in that cold, where thinking itself felt like a muscle that could seize clarity, had become his most precious resource. Outside, snow piled higher against the door. The logs creaked with every gust, as if the cabin had started aging faster. The roof held, but Wyatt didn't like how the weight was settling. He stood, listened to the rafters, then used his rifle again, this time gently propping one crossbeam with a wedge of firewood. If the roof went, there'd be no second chances. Back by the fire, he repeated the ritual. A second roast. Slower this time. He held the beans in his palm before setting them on the stone. They were warm already. He rotated them by touch, watching their skin begin to glisten. He didn't need a clock. He used the fire's rhythm, the way it pulsed under the logs, to time each batch. He crushed them again with the butt of the rifle, poured the melted snow through his makeshift filter, and drank. This time, the difference was sharp. The dull throb behind his eyes eased. He didn't feel awake so much as present. The small sounds came back. Snow slipping from a branch, the fire's breath, even his own pulse in his ears. He could think in complete thoughts again. Could remember the ridgeline he'd crossed, the cabin's orientation, even the faint trails that might still be passable beneath the storm. He felt the edges of himself return, not in ego, but in awareness. And as he laid another log on the fire, rifle still warm in his grip, he realized something. This wasn't about caffeine. It wasn't about the beans or the brew. It was about control. In a world where even the sky turned against you, Wyatt had carved out one small, precise system: fire, timing, thought that still answered to him. And in a storm like this, that kind of power meant everything. Wyatt didn't sleep that night, not fully. He dozed in stretches, boots on, back to the wall. His hat pulled low, but his senses tuned like a fiddle string. Every hour or so, he'd stir the fire and roast a few more beans. Not because he needed more coffee, but because the rhythm of it, roast, crush, drip, sip, kept his mind engaged, kept the fear from filling the cracks that the cold had opened. By morning, the storm hadn't relented. If anything, it had thickened. The light outside was pale and shapeless, like someone had thrown a sheet over the sun. Snow pressed against the small window, muting the world down to firelight and breath. The fire had burned low, but not out. He still had wood, though not much. Enough for a day, maybe two. Less if the wind turned harsher. That's when Wyatt tried something different. He remembered Elias, again. Not the man this time, but the night his grandfather had shown him how to roast without flame. It was a winter evening in a dugout hut on the edge of the Pecos, and Wyatt had been too sick to speak burning up with. Fever, too weak to hold a cup. Elias had set the beans in the ashes instead of on the iron. "Let the ghost of the fire do the work," he'd whispered. Wyatt tried that now. He dug into the bed of embers, careful not to collapse the whole thing. He pulled a flat stone from the hearth wall and set it deep in the coals, then scattered the beans over it. No flame. Just heat slow, enveloping even. The cabin filled with a scent again, but this time it wasn't sharp or bitter. It was calm, rich, earthy. The smell didn't just clear his head. It anchored him. He watched the beans crack and swell. Then he crushed them gently, folded them into the saddlecloth filter, and began the snowmelt pour again, slower now, deliberate. Each drop hissed when it hit the grounds, then darkened as it pulled life out of them. He sipped, not for flavor, for presence. It worked, better than before. The storm outside didn't change, but he had. His hand steadied. His memory returned in full. Color. He could recall every fence post between here and Sweetwater. He remembered the broken spur he'd meant to fix last week. He remembered the name of a girl he hadn't thought about in years. That's when he realized something else. The trick wasn't just in the coffee, it was in the process. Every step required focus. Roasting without burning, crushing without powdering, pouring at the right speed, from the right height, in the right sequence. It was a ritual one that stitched the mind back together in real time. The storm still clawed at the world outside. But inside, Wyatt wasn't fading anymore. He was thinking again. He was watching, feeling, preparing. The cold could still kill a man, but not if that man stayed sharp. And Wyatt had found something stronger than fire to keep his edge. Something warm, bitter, and perfectly timed to keep thought alive when everything else tried to take it. By midday, Wyatt's canteen was nearly dry. What little he had left tasted of old leather and rusted tin drinkable, sure, but only in the way desperation makes anything go down. He stared at the hearth, then at the melting snow he'd scooped earlier into a hollowed pine bowl. It was barely half full now, and dirty with soot. The fire had burned hotter than he'd planned. He needed more water, not just to drink, but to brew. If the trick was going to hold, if he was going to stay himself, he couldn't let that rhythm break. The trouble was, snow's a liar. You'd think a whole drift would give you gallons, but by the time it melts, it's barely a mouthful. And if you don't melt it right, it picks up every bitter edge of the wood. It touches smoke, ash, even bark oils. Wyatt had seen men lose days to gut sickness from drinking firewater snow. He wouldn't make that mistake. He grabbed his hatchet, stepped to the cabin's back wall, and knocked loose the snow that had piled like a tomb against the beams. It fell in heavy sheets, revealing the old trough he'd carved last year, half a log split and hollowed out, now packed with ice. He filled his saddlebag with snow, brought it in, and set the wet load near the fire, but not too close. That was the trick. Too close, and the bottom would scorch. Too far, and it wouldn't melt fast enough. Elias had taught him this one too, the snow melt method from the old vaqueros in the Sierra Madres. Always layer it, he'd said. Let the bottom melt while the top stays cold. That way, the water keeps sweet. Wyatt didn't understand the science, but he remembered the taste. So he packed the snow tight in a tin plate, punched a hole in the bottom with his knife, and let it drip into the pine bowl below. Slow, steady, cold water that stayed clean. It took an hour to get enough for 1 cup. But when he poured it through his filter beans roasted just right, cloth stretched taut. The brew came out smooth, almost silky. Not sweet, not floral, not anything a fancy a shop would bottle. Just correct. The kind of correct that held the mind upright. He sipped. The warmth rolled through him, not in a rush, but like a candle flame against the inside of his chest. His thoughts stayed sharp. He noticed a draft near the door he hadn't felt before, patched it with a rolled blanket, heard the shift in the roof timbers, not a creak, but a split. He climbed up and wedged a second brace under the west beam, saving the roof from a sag it might not have survived. That's what clarity buys you. Not poetry, not euphoria, just the ability to notice. To respond. Snow was still falling, thicker now. Wyatt pressed his palm against the wall and felt the cold seeping through. But his eyes were steady, and the ember of alertness in his chest, fueled by roasted beans and careful meltwater, burned on. He wasn't surviving by luck anymore. He was thinking his way through it. The wind shifted around dusk. It no longer howled, but hummed a deeper, more dangerous kind of sound, like it had stopped fighting and started watching. Wyatt listened from the floor of the cabin, his back against the wall, cup nestled between his hands. The latest brew was darker than before, thicker, not quite bitter, but earthy, like something dug up instead of grown. He sipped slow, let it sit on his tongue, and realized something strange. The taste didn't just warm him, it unlocked him. Memories he hadn't summoned in years drifted in like smoke under a door. The first time he held reins. His father's voice on a cold morning in Abilene, telling him, "Don't let the weather take more than it needs to." The way his mother used to boil chicory root when coffee ran out, bitter as sin, but strong enough to keep a man walking. And then, clearer than all the rest, Elias again, sitting by a fire with a cup the color of gunmetal and a look in his eye like he was remembering the whole world at once. Wyatt blinked. The fire cracked. He wasn't sure what exactly had brought the memory back. Maybe it was the way the embers glowed through the cloth filter. Maybe it was the shape of the cabin itself, small, warm, silent. Or maybe it was that moment all survivors hit when time folds and the past becomes not just relevant, but necessary. Because that's what this coffee had become. Not a drink, not a habit, a tool for memory, for presence, for anchoring the self to something solid when the storm tried to strip it away. Wyatt took another sip. He remembered the trail south, the way it curved around the canyons where the wind could trick a man into walking in circles. He remembered the camp cook's trick of using pine needles to clear a man's sinuses. He remembered how many head were waiting and how many hands would be watching the ridgeline, wondering if he'd make it back. And then he remembered the pistol under the saddle blanket, not because he needed it, but because it was the kind of detail a sharp mind doesn't forget. He stood, stretched, and checked the lock dry, loaded, primed, just in case. Outside, the wind dropped low, not quiet, just stealthy. Wyatt crouched near the fire, holding the cup close. He stared at the surface of the coffee, watching it tremble with every gust. He knew now why the trick worked. It wasn't about caffeine or chemistry. It was about routine, intentional slowness in the face of chaos. A series of small, deliberate acts that reassert control over a world that wanted to take it away. This cup, these roasted beans, this meltwater, they were more than fuel. They were memory in liquid form, each one tied to a time, a place, a lesson, and with each sip, Wyatt stitched those lessons back into the present. The storm hadn't let up, but neither had he, and that balanced the storm outside. The clarity inside was all he needed to keep going. By the third day, time had changed shape. The storm outside no longer felt like an event. It felt like a fact, like mountains or silence. It had settled over the land without malice, but without mercy either. Wyatt had stopped wondering when it would end. That kind of thinking made a man soft. Instead, he focused on what could be controlled: the fire, the snowmelt, the beans, the rhythm of staying awake. The cabin had shrunk, not in size, in purpose. It had become a shell of function. Every item had a role, every movement a meaning. The rifle stayed by the door. The woodpile was counted by the hour, not by the cord. His saddlebag hung from the rafters, away from curious teeth and drifting damp. And the beans, those dark, glossy survivors from warmer lands, had earned a place beside the flint as his most trusted tools. He had 5 brews left, maybe 6 if he rationed, but he didn't, not today. He needed all of it. The night before, the wolf had passed. but its message hadn't. Wyatt had felt the question in those yellow eyes. Are you here? Are you present? Most men in a snowbound cabin would have slept through it, died with a door half barred, been buried beneath frost before morning. But he hadn't, because of the trick, because of the fire, because of the brew. So he brewed again. This time he roasted the beans directly in his hand, cupped over the coals, careful not to burn. It took longer, hurt a little. But the scent was purer that way, closer, like drawing memory through skin. He crushed them smooth between two flat stones, filtered them through the same cloth now stained dark with use, and let the water drip slow. Not because he was out of time, but because time itself had become the process. The sip hit him like it always did, warm, bitter, exact. His pulse slowed, but his mind didn't. The fire burned steady, low, quiet, the kind of fire a man could think by. And that's what Wyatt did, he thought. He reviewed the land in his mind, the trail, the hills, the old creek bed, buried now under snow. He remembered the elk path that curved south, where the drifts might not be as deep. He recalled a grove of pine where the snow didn't fall so heavy. He could see the map behind his eyes, vivid as a lantern's flame, because that's what firelight does when paired with focus. It illuminates from the inside out. He didn't speak, not even to himself. No muttered plans, no half-formed prayers, just presence, just clarity, just command over the space he held. And when the wind rose again, shaking the shutters and moaning through the seams, Wyatt didn't flinch. He looked at the flame, then at the cup, then at the door. He was ready. The storm broke on the fourth day, not like a thunderclap, more like a slow sigh from the sky. The wind softened, the snow thinned. Light, real light, pressed through the frost-streaked window like a forgotten friend. Wyatt stood in the doorway just after dawn, eyes narrowed against the glare. Everything was white. The landscape had changed. Trees looked unfamiliar, under their burden. Paths had vanished, landmarks erased, but he was calm, focused. He hadn't lost himself. He moved with purpose. Now no wasted motion. The firewood was down to a quarter stack, the beans to a final handful. He roasted them gently over the last ember bed, stirred with a twig stripped of bark, and brewed one final cup with melted snow that still shimmered with last night's cold. He drank it slowly. Not like a reward, like a ceremony, a closing circle, and that's when the sound came, hoofbeats, distant, careful, 2 horses, maybe 3. Wyatt stepped outside, rifle slung but not raised. From the trees emerged a figure lean, cloaked in a snow-crusted poncho, scarf pulled high, a scout, young, maybe 20. Skin wind-burned, beard half-grown. His eyes scanned the cabin like he didn't quite believe it was real. "You Wyatt Ford?" the scout asked. Wyatt nodded. "They sent me up from Sweetwater. Figured you'd be late, but they didn't count on this." He swept his arm toward the endless snowdrifts. Wyatt stepped aside. Fire's still going. The scout entered like a man walking into legend. He paused at the door, blinking at the warmth. Then his eyes locked onto the strange setup by the hearth. The blackened stones, the saddlecloth hung like a filter, the pouch of roasted beans nearly gone. He sniffed. "You been making coffee?" Wyatt gave a half-smile. "Something like it." The scout crouched near the hearth, held his hands out. "I been half crazy 3 days riding through that mess. Near lost the trail more than once. Thought I was seeing things when I saw the smoke. But you—" He looked around, then back at the filter. "You been thinking. Not just surviving." Wyatt nodded again. "Storm's not what gets most men. It's what it steals." The scout reached for the cloth filter like it was a relic. "Mind if I learn how you made this?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. He just handed over the pouch a few beans left, enough for a single brew. The scout looked down at them like they were gold dust. Then he sat, unwrapping his gloves, eager to listen. And in that quiet moment, the fire crackling low, snow melting in a pan, steam rising through morning light, a cowboy's odd little trick began its second life. Not because it was magic, because it had worked. Because it had made one man sharp enough to last when others blurred into the storm. And now it was about to keep another man sharp too. By spring, the storm was already a story, told in bunkhouses and beside branding fires, passed between riders over fence posts and across supper tables. They all said the same thing. Wyatt Ford came down from the mountains sharper than when he went up. And folks didn't say that kind of thing lightly. It wasn't just that he'd survived, others had too. But Wyatt hadn't just endured, he'd stayed himself, clear-eyed, focused. Like the storm had refined him, not broken him. And when people asked how, they didn't get much, just a few dry words, maybe a shrug, maybe a tilt of the chin toward the hearth. But the scout told it better. He'd carried the story south, first to Sweetwater, then to other camps as spring drives began. Not about the storm, about the coffee, about the fire method, about the smell of roasted beans drifting through a blizzard, about a cowboy so dialed in he could hear a wolf in white silence and patch a beam by instinct. He told them how Wyatt had used a piece of saddlecloth and firelight to stay sharp while the world blurred, how he melted snow like a medicine man and brewed memory into every cup, how the ritual itself became his lifeline. Other men started trying it, at first just for novelty, roasting beans over coals, filtering with what they had. But something in the process stuck. The focus, the warmth, the way it gave you a grip on your own thoughts. Soon, trail bosses carried beans not just for the pot, but for clarity. Riders roasted in the early hours before sunup. Scouts steeped them slow in the quiet dusk before night watch. Some called it storm brew. Others just said, make it the Ford way. No one patented it, no one wrote it down, but it spread not because of taste, but because of effect. Men who'd once ridden into cold months with nothing but instinct and stubbornness now carried one more tool, the knowledge that alertness wasn't luck, it was a choice, a preparation, a discipline. Years later, Wyatt never bragged, never claimed to invent anything. When asked, he'd just smile and say, I didn't make a new drink. I just remembered an old one. And then he'd toss a few beans on the coals, crushing them with the heel of his boot, and let the scent rise like smoke from another lifetime. That was the real legacy, not the method, but the mindset. That in a world built to strip men bare, thinking clearly was still a form of resistance. That when storms came snow, silence or sorrow, the smallest fire, the simplest ritual, could hold a man together. And that somewhere in the high mountains, one cowboy's foolish little coffee trick had kept the frost from freezing his mind and passed that warmth on to others who might one day need it. The trick traveled because the truth it carried always will.